In part 2, we are going to focus on construction methods as we build the Eduard Zero. Once again, I'm using the gun primer razor glass file to remove the nubs to make sure that the two cockpit halves go together cleanly. As you can see, with proper sanding, the two halves go together perfectly. I'm just using some Tamiya extra thin quick setting to put the two halves together and press fit. Yeah, put on way too much glue, as you can see. The good news with that Tamiya extra thin is it's really not going to matter in the end. As long as you don't touch the glue. Just do not touch the glue, otherwise instant fingerprint. The way Eduard designed the cockpit to go together is kind of the cockpit tub slides in from the bottom. Be tempted to do it the more traditional method, where you just put the two halves together and put all the details all on the sides and then put in the bottom. However, I wanted to fit by the books and it worked. The only thing is there's all sorts of little dials and stuff, and it was very nerve-wracking thinking that something's just gonna ping off, but everything went together. Once again, using my glass file to kind of remove those little nubs so I can put the top and bottom of the wings together. Fit for the wings top and bottom portions were near perfect. There was one part where I'm going to definitely need to do some sanding, but very impressive. Fitting the fuselage to the wings were pretty straightforward and maybe took a little bit of wiggling to get into place, but it was really, really close to being spot on. There's really not much I could notice that was kind of askew until later when I was actually putting down the paint. I noticed that it's just a little bit off, so maybe not perfect, but man, you're going to have magnifying glass to kind of look at that kind of scrutiny. To make sure that there wasn't any gap at the wing root, I used a long piece of masking tape to just kind of give it a little bit of tension to make sure that we don't have any gaps. For sanding the seams, I really didn't want to lose any of that fine surface detail, so I added some masking tape to the sides and then used my 600 grit sanding sponge to just be able to knock that out, and really with one pass, it was gone. As I said earlier, the leading edge of one of the wings took a little bit more work than what I was expecting with the rest of the plane, but otherwise not bad. Continued with the same method on the lower fuselage and just sanded that out. There's a little bit more issue towards, I guess, the front of the portion, the forward portion of that seam, but otherwise cleaned up pretty easily. And we've located a nasty seam that just needs a little bit more work. You can kind of notice a little bit more shimmer compared to the rest. So just more masking tape and more sanding. To check my seams, I'm going back to an old approach, grabbing a Sharpie and just dragging it along each of the seams. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come back with just a little bit of sandpaper. And then if you see any blue lines, you know that you have a seam that needs to be cleaned up. And pretty easily we can see that there's a little bit of an issue with the back of the cockpit that needs to be fixed up. As you can see in most areas, the blue just simply disappears with just that light 1500 grit sanding. But there's certain areas where you can see some remnants of blue that are just poking through little seams. So that's going to need some TLC a little later. As we sand away the rear of the fuselage, you can see how it equally sands. There's no stark lines that we can see with seams. So it looks like everything looks as it should. Now for that pesky seam that's in the aft of the cockpit. We're going to sand that down and see if we can eliminate it. Granted, who knows if it's actually going to be seen through the windscreen, but I don't know. This is a good example of showing you what the seam line is going to look like after paint, especially with those shiny bits that are poking out. Since we did remove some of the detail to the riveting, we are going to need to restore it. I'm just doing this freehand with the trumpeter riveting tool. If you really want a straight line, you definitely want to use some guide tape, but you know what, I think I had close enough. We also want to make sure that we're restoring the panel lines that were removed with sanding. I'm doing this with just a Tamiya saw that is based off a photo etch, so it's super thin. Works really well for these, especially where you have an Eduard kit where the panel lines are a little bit small. If you're running into something more like an Airfix kit, you probably can just use a hacksaw, and that'll replicate, you know, the width of the panel lines for that subject. Uh-oh, we've got a nasty seam line. This one is going to need a little bit more surgery. What I'm using is just some UV curing glue. Really like for different subjects where we're not really doing a whole lot of sanding to it, or we just want it to flow in place. And sometimes when you just move it around with the toothpick and just get it in place and smooth it around, it'll be perfect right off the bat. I'm just using a toothpick to just kind of blend it around, and it's pretty thin, so it's just going to go into all the different recesses. Don't worry if you're using too much, you can just get a Q-tip and just kind of remove the excess as I'm doing right there. Once I think I like the placement of the UV curing glue, I, cure it with a UV flashlight. So let that sit for about 5 seconds, and then it's cured and ready to go to sanding or whatever else we need to do. With these seams, there is a little bit of cleanup that needs to be done, so I'm just getting into some thin sandpaper sticks and just making sure that it's nice and smooth. once I think it looks good, I'm going to check that with a Sharpie. And this does need a little bit of polishing. It's a little rough. Here's a good example of a seam line that needs to be filled. You can see where you have that blue line. You can either just sand all the way through it, or what I'm going to do is just add some more UV glue to just fill it up. And just like that, they are removed. They also will not be affected by different lacquer thinners and all that. So we're not going to have those things pop back up again. Eduard came up with something pretty genius for the cowling. So they give you this little jig that lets you align everything. Make sure you are actually aligning everything properly. I got a little confused, sadly, on the first go. But make sure that those flaps are actually lining up into those grooves, and then just glue it in place. Also, be light on the glue, because you could glue the thing to the jig. Luckily, I didn't have any problems with that. Whether the jig is absolutely necessary is a whole nother topic of debate. There's some nice little alignment marks and notches, so you could, in theory, put the thing together without the jig, and it would probably go together very, very well. The exhaust ports on this are lacking a lot of details. You can see they're just shallow, and so probably won't be noticeable. And I'm sure Eduard's going to release some kind of replacement part that it's probably printed or resin that look really good, but I don't got time for that. So I'm drilling them out and just using just a tiny drill to kind of get a starting hole and then just kind of work it. Right now, as you can see, it's a little rough. So just going to be using a hobby knife to kind of clean up around the edges and get into a better look. But that's going to add a lot more realism. Thanks for watching. See you on the next episode. Make sure you subscribe.